Chapter 4, Charcoal Alley. Through the 1950s, we remained in Watts, moving from one house to another. However, the expenses of raising a growing family finally drove my father into debt, forcing him to move us into the newly built Jordan Downs housing project. Part of a New Deal housing plan, Jordan Downs and other projects in LA were meant to ease the housing crunch facing returning soldiers and for the working poor. At first, the project struck me as gorgeous, resembling a manicured campus, green, tidy, organized, with parks and schools. The buildings fit in with the landscape, built just 2 stories high with lots of space in between. There were no restricted gang territories. It was open and felt free. In the spring, I'd walk up to the fence and watch the baseball games at Jordan High. Initially, families had to qualify to gain entry, had to prove employment, and agree to residency standards. But over time, the dual plague of gangs and drugs began to bring the projects down. Residents without jobs failed to keep up their property. People started destroying the grounds, litter and graffiti spread. My family did everything they could to keep out of the riffraff, but it was sad to see the projects decay and the quality of life decline. But despite the worsening conditions, the strong hand of both parents held our growing brood in line. And as the oldest, I did my part as well. I looked after my siblings and helped my parents run the house. I stayed away from the gangs, even though they courted me. Used all of the gang seductions, the girls, the money, the respect, the rep. They had their own way of walking, talking, dressing, and being. They were in, hip-hop and cool. My father talked to me about them and put it straight up. If I choose to hang out with the gang, then they be my family. Run with them and don't come back, he said. Right there, I knew the gangs were a dead end. And I had several advantages for keeping them at a distance. They gave me a pass because I was a dedicated athlete. They also didn't mess with me because I had lovely sisters they wanted to date. I never let them near my sisters, but they kept trying. And they knew that if they messed with me, they'd have no chance. But most important, the gangs knew I didn't want in and knew I would fight to keep myself out. As my mother matured, she proved herself a natural leader, the head of the household who kept things under control. But as was the family way, when she ruled, she'd flashed a fierce temper. Discipline had the feel of the Old South. If we crossed her, we knew that we would get the shoe. Back in Louisiana, Maddie was quite a softball player, strong, athletic. But when she threw a shoe, it was straight out of the major leagues, high and hard. Sometimes, I swear, she could throw a curve, the shoe hitting us long after we'd taken a corner on a dead run. I still remember a time when my younger brother Kurt came home late, really late, making a mockery out of Maddie's curfew. And she fixed him. She bolted the door and nailed every window in the house shut except one. And when he tried to snake through that one, she was waiting for him. She slammed the window down on him so that his legs were outside, his chest and arms inside. And then she pummeled him with shoe after shoe. She never let any of us forget that she was the enforcer. Her motto, subdue the head and the body follows. And it wasn't just shoes. When my sister Barbara lagged in doing the dishes, engaging in a small act of passive resistance, Maddie, her hands covered in flour, just stared at her and returned to kneading the dough. Then, whack! Fast as a fired shoe, Maddie struck out with her right hand. And there stood Barbara, stunned, a big white handprint across her black face. When Gordon, fascinated by fire, set the couch ablaze, Maddie made him sit there with a book of matches, light each one, and watch it burn to the end. By the time the book was empty, Gordon's fingers looked like hot dogs blackened at a wiener's roast. But for certain wrongdoings, we Alexander children could only have hoped for Mama's wrath. If we really upset her, made her feel disrespected, she simply issued those most dreaded words, "Wait till your father gets home." The hours were the slowest and most terrifying, sitting alone in our room and waiting, the fear as harsh as the pain to come. For the girls, it would be the cord of an iron or electrical wires. For the boys, a cypress switch. The cords and wires he reused. The tree out back ran bare of low-hanging branches. This was the violent code of the South, inflicted, generation after generation, upon all its sons and daughters. We were children of a harsh Southern love. Justice wasn't gentle. Besides demanding discipline and responsibility, my mother also stressed education. From her ancestors back home, Maddie learned there were two ways for blacks to gain control over their lives: the church and education. They told her that after the Civil War ended and the slaves were freed, no government could protect Southern black folk. Reconstruction, called the glorious failure for his grand dreams and broken hopes, ended just 10 years after the war. At that point, the forces of reaction, white redeemers, and the Ku Klux Klan did all they could to keep blacks in their place, making sure they couldn't vote or own land. Southern blacks held paper promises, but saw a few material gains. The chains of slavery gave way to the walls of Jim Crow. For my family, the worlds of church and education provided the antidotes to the injustices of segregation. These two worlds were tightly linked. Several of my ancestors were preachers, and they made sure their family got the message. Our only peace, the church. Our only hope, the grace of God. The only way to know Him, to read His good word. Heeding these words, Maddie took it as her mission that all 11 of us would attend private parochial schools, ensuring we received Catholic instruction. And whether it was through formal education or individual study, the power of knowledge stayed with all of the Alexander children for the rest of their lives. Books, we were told, contained knowledge, and knowledge translated to power. No wonder masters kept slaves illiterate, allowed only hand-picked Bible stories about turning cheeks and the meek inheriting the earth. Thus, we were taught to treasure books, to review them as keys to opportunity. There was only one place I was free to go after school: the library. I remember looking at the rows of books on the shelves, setting a goal to complete a book, then a row, then a shelf. My favorites were stories of adventure and survival. From an early age, I needed little sleep and became a night owl. Always last to bed, I read by a single lamp into the small hours of the night. Finally, for Maddie, it was always a world without excuses. You were responsible for controlling your own life. Booker T. Washington was the model, with his message of self-help, self-improvement, and the need to prove your own worth. And he didn't just say it, he did it. True to his code, he helped others improve through practical study at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. For what Booker T preached was the truth. You can make all the speeches you want about education and human dignity, but if you aren't self-sufficient, you end up dependent. Without economic independence, you can never be free. That was a lesson of history. So learn your history, she'd say. It makes you who you are. Just don't let it control where you go. As I applied these lessons while growing up, I was constantly reminded of two things. I had exceptional athletic talent, and if I didn't learn to control my temper, my talent was worthless. Two incidents in my life, both dealing with sports and anger, helped mold my future. The first took place during a Catholic youth organization football game when I was 12. When the referee blew the whistle, I lost control, yelling, throwing my helmet, and slamming the ball at his feet. My father, watching my meltdown from the sideline, stormed onto the field, grabbed me by my collar, and dragged me away, humiliating me in front of everyone. The 5'4" ex-Marine then told the coach, a priest from my school, that I would not return to the game until I learned to control myself and stop embarrassing my family. There he was, short but looming, another man of presence. He projected himself. He cast a long shadow. "Do it or else," he said. "Yes, sir." The second incident occurred in the boxing ring. My father was a great boxer and taught me the art, knocking me out several times in the process. Once when I was 15, an older, more seasoned fighter thrashed me in the ring. Embarrassed and enraged, I tracked the guy down and damn near beat him to death. Following this explosion, my father dressed down both my boxing coach and me. He told the coach he needed to help me, or all my talents would be wasted. Then he told me that unless I learned to channel my rage, I would end up just another killer. And he had been true to his words. When he was at the breaking point with Louisiana Cluxers, he channeled his violence into the armed services, took it out on our enemies. When he was ready to explode after being Jim Crowed, instead of getting thrown in jail or lynched, he took his anger, packed his bags, and headed west. Remember, behave or we'll bury you. I didn't forget. I vowed never to let rage control me again. And soon after, at Mount Carmel High School in South Central LA, I found the release of my anger, as well as my passion, football. Prior to this time, I considered baseball my most promising sport. I loved to play it, and had magical memories of sitting around the radio with my family as we cheered for Jackie Robinson and the Brooklyn Dodgers. But baseball didn't free my anger like football. On the gridiron, you could go berserk. You could vent your hate in a way that few legitimate pursuits allowed. Knocking someone out was not only legal, it got you a standing O. In high school, the rage remained. It was just better directed. It was violence condoned, and my adolescent fury lashed freely. During football season, my whole family came out every Friday night to cheer their rising star. In 1959, when I graduated from Mount Carmel, I was recruited by universities with Division 1A football programs. For me, the choice came down to two schools, UCLA and USC. I love Los Angeles and now considered it home, for despite its problems, the city still offered blacks better opportunities than just about anywhere else. It was no racial paradise, but it sure beat Dixie. Ultimately, the decision was easy, UCLA. No white universities had treated black athletes better. It was at UCLA that Tom Bradley excelled in track and field in the 30s, where Woody Strode and Kenny Washington starred in football before breaking the NFL's color barrier in 1946, and where Jackie Robinson was a four-letter man in baseball, basketball, football, and track before becoming the first black major leaguer in 1947. Furthermore, in 1949, 5 years before the Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Board of Education, UCLA was the first primarily white college in America to elect an African American, Cheryl Luke, its student body president. From 1959 and 1963, I played on both sides of the ball at UCLA, as a cornerback and safety on defense and as a running back on offense. I was honored as an All-American in both football and track and won the NCAA Triple Jump Championship. While competing, I studied kinesiology and sociology. At the time, my plan was to compete in the 1964 Summer Olympics in Tokyo, then go to graduate school, earn a PhD, and become a professor. However, during my senior year at UCLA, my coaches told me that I would go high in the upcoming draft and could be a professional football player. I was still skeptical, but they told me I would start receiving an immediate paycheck instead of spending the next 7 years in graduate school. That clinched it for me. For the first time since my family moved west, I could pay off their debt. In 1963, I entered the draft. At the time, there were two professional leagues, and I received offers from both the 49ers of the National Football League and the Broncos of the American Football League. The Niners picked me 8th overall, the Broncos 5th. I signed with San Francisco and moved up north. When I left Los Angeles for the Bay Area, I swore I'd stay close to my family. The lessons were well ingrained. Be responsible, take care of your own, don't expect anyone else to do it for you. Like my legendary great-grandfather, I must be the family's guardian. As the oldest son and now a professional athlete, it was my job to provide for my mother and 10 siblings. Once I started receiving NFL paychecks, I made Maddie's dream of sending all her children to private schools come true. In the summer of 1965, getting ready for my 3rd season in the league, I reported a training camp with the 49ers in Northern California. But on August 11th, I was horrified when tragedy struck the streets of Watts. What started out as a seemingly routine traffic stop of a 20-year-old black man named Marquette Fry exploded into urban warfare. Knowing the neighborhood, I feared something like this could happen. There was much grief in Watts. Jobs shrank, housing declined, police brutality rose. But tragically, what began as community protests flared into out-of-control vandalism. Gang members and criminals trashed the stores and burned buildings, acts of self-destruction that simply ruined things for everyone left behind. Most alarming to me, my family lived in the heart of the combat zone, across the street from Will Rogers Park. Frantically, I tried to get through on the phone, over and over, but with no luck. There was no service in the neighborhood. Back in training camp, I watched the disaster unfold on TV. I saw National Guardsmen trade gunfire with snipers on surrounding rooftops. I saw familiar buildings go up in flames. I wanted to fly down, rush in, and drag my family out. But no one was allowed in. The neighborhood was barricaded, sealed off. Smoke and flames filled the screen. Unable to do anything but sit and watch made me want to scream or put my fist through the set. More calls, still no word. I slammed down the receiver. As night falls and the flames gut Watts, a scene plays out that will impact my family years later. A 17-year-old black female named Sandra Lee Holt sits on her bed in her mother's home. Her back is against the wall and her legs are bent at the knees. She has not slept for 2 days. The riots, the noise, the thrill, the fear, the drugs have all kept her awake. Now, as she often does, she stares before her at a crack in the wall opposite her bed. It looks like a spider, and sometimes she thinks she sees it move. Other times, she's sure of it. Sometimes it gets inside her head, pushing up against her eyes, causing her great pain. Outside, glass breaks, voices are raised. Someone yells, "Burn, baby, burn." Inside, through her closed door, she hears a man's voice. "Come here," he says. Her mother laughs in response. Too loud, drunken, exaggerated. Sandra hears her crash and bodies falling to the floor. Hysterical laughter, then giggling and pawing. It will all be fun until it isn't, until he starts to hit her. It doesn't matter who he is. It always ends up the same. Sandra darts her eyes to the door to make sure it's locked. It is. It is always bad when he comes in. That's what makes her hate. Focusing on the door makes the spidey go away, but not the pain. Every sound is amplified. Fire engines, voices, footsteps, slamming doors, and breaking glass. All too damn loud. She wants to scream, to hit people, to hurt herself. She reaches for the bottle on the floor, takes 2 long swigs of whiskey, then returns to her position against the wall. She cradles the bottle under her right arm. As she leans back, she feels her belly move. There has been more of that lately. For a minute, it breaks the bad thoughts, hints at something nice. She takes another long drink. Her mind stops raging, and she rubs her swollen belly from top to bottom, up and down. She is 6 months pregnant. 6 months ago, she met the father-to-be at a party. Now he's in jail, but he will be out soon. She quit school after learning she was soon to be a mother. Calm thoughts, she now tells herself. She must have calm thoughts. Everything will change with the baby's birth. All will be new and better. Finally, something to call her own, something over which she will have control. One more drink, and a little more control over her thoughts. She had heard people say, you should talk to your baby, even before it is born. Say nice things, and then the baby will be born with nice thoughts. It's okay, baby, it's okay, she says, soothing her restless unborn. She hopes the baby hears her voice, but not the noise. Inside the house, her mother's man bangs on the door. Her mother is screaming. Outside, sirens, bullhorns, rage. She squeezes a pillow over her head to quell the pain. It's okay, baby, she chants, and she rocks back and forth. Finally, the following day, I heard from my mother. The family was safe, distraught and shaken up, but safe. But everyone knew that the neighborhood would never be the same. The riots caused more than $40 million in damage. 34 people died. More than 1,000 were injured. Another 4,000 arrested. Our street had a new nickname, Charcoal Alley. For weeks following, the papers were filled with ominous warnings. The McCone Commission, established by Governor Pat Brown to assess the causes of the disturbance, decried a deep sickness infecting the community, spoke of dashed expectations, frustration, and disillusionment of illiterate, unemployable youth who quit school to take to the streets. Working as a probation officer in San Francisco in the off-season, I was all too familiar with such problems. I knew the dire predictions to be true. I vowed to move my family out of Watts. At the time, my career was peaking. I led the team in interceptions. I would soon make All-Pro. I could afford to move them. It was my duty. And when Maddie told me that she and my father were separating, the need to move turned urgent. The thought of her living as a single mother in the tinderbox of Watts made me shudder. She was attached to her neighbors, church, community, and routine. It would take a near-perfect scenario to convince her to leave these behind. In 1967, 2 years after the Watts riots, I finally succeeded. I rented a house belonging to the wife of a former UCLA teammate. It had been her family home growing up. It was a clean, one-floor bungalow on a quiet palm-lined street. The neighborhood was residential, largely white, with an address of 126 West 59th Street. It was a few houses west of Main, the dividing line between East and West LA. This carried great symbolic weight. This meant that the Alexander family had arrived. They could now say they lived on the west side. When my brother Gordon first set foot in the house, he was overcome. He got down on his hands and knees and kissed the floor.